Rolling. Whoops. Yes.
Hi, here we are at the Sense Kitchen, and our recipe story for today is tender beans. I make that tender beans. So anyway, tender beans is about in the context of stress. And I did some study on stress, and one of the things I really remember from doing all this research for a thesis was that they found that there are people that have a harder time with stress. And these people, the tender beings, have a very low threshold for stimulus. So I remember when I was a kid and I was somewhere on a job or something, and this woman, I was squawking or whining about something, and she said, "Well, you're just a tenderhead." I thought, what's a tenderhead? But when I think back on it, I mean, this woman had like an expression for children that were, sensitive. So I think parents probably understand that there are children with sensitivities. So I want to tell you my story a little bit and why the stimulus is important, the low threshold for stimulus. And I'll explain that in a minute. My story is that I was a witness to domestic violence, probably between the ages of 5 and 14. And being in that situation of witnessing domestic violence, what happens is that this low threshold for stimulus is really important to understand, because where some children could maybe integrate that and not be fragmented by that stimulus of domestic violence, I do have a low threshold for stimulus. So imagine domestic violence. And so I want to take a person I give you an example of a person who has a higher threshold for the stimulus of like loud voices, for instance, or traffic, or a multitude of things happening at once, or crowds. So imagine this is the person who doesn't get easily rattled, that is thick-skinned. And imagine the balloon as their skin. And you can do all kinds of things to them. They can take lots of stimulus and nothing happens. They're just, not that affected by high stimulus. So now we're going to take the person with a low threshold for stimulus. And this is your tenderhead child, your sensitive child. So what's important about stress is understanding that your threshold for stimulus. And it actually is a pretty important concept with stress because innate neurology is a part of recognizing stress, and you're going to recognize different kinds of stressors if your innate neurology, if you're sensitive. So part of perception is, you've heard the stories about the person who, they just seem to be stressed by the slightest little thing. And their innate neurology, part of their perception is this low threshold for stimulus. So here's another person who has a low threshold for stimulus. And they can take a little stimulus, but they really can't take that much sometimes. So going back to my recipe for tender beans, let's talk a little bit more about stress. And there are a couple models for stress. And one of the models was by Hans Seeley, and his model was the stimulus response model. There's a lesser-known model for stress, which was postulated by Richard Lazarus. And his theory of stress, his model of stress, was a transactional model of stress. And basically what he said is you have a stressor and there's a transactional process that takes place. And that transactional process of you really having the degree of stress you experience is dependent on your learning, your coping skills, your cognitive skills, so that basically your ability is not just stimulus response. It's stimulus, then learning and mindfulness and trying to be relaxed and not overreact, and then you just, you can think about it, like you can look at the big picture and see, two ends of, your thought process, like, this is just totally bad, I can't stand it, this is the worst thing in the world, to the other extreme, this is really not that important. And somehow you're able to, with your cognition, is be able to see the gray area when you're stressed. So you kind of use your mind to deal with stress. So the transactional model gives us a lot of interest in learning. So I'm just going to kind of wrap this up with one more idea. And that idea is, when I was doing my study, I called my study the sensory cognitive information processing model for stress. And I want to read to you the perception side of stress. And I want to tell you what's involved in the perception side of stress. And some of those things are your innate neurology, which I mentioned previously, your past experience, your ego development, and that's kind of, your ability to put yourself in a firm place in the world. And you know who you are. Body memories and coping skills. So that's a lot to take in, but it is useful if you're learning how to have better interpersonal relationships, or how to cope better with distress. I mean, just to not suffer as much as you have to, cut down on your suffering, cut down on your worrying, cut down on your monkey mind and all the things that can make life a little difficult. So, perception, innate neurology, past experience, ego development, body memories, and coping skills. So, on the other side of what the information processing model are these factors. So if you want to have free choice when you're experiencing stress, this model says that you have to do some information processing to have a free choice when you're stressed. And so this particular model that I found in my research said to respond to stress and have free choice, not defensive choice, not to be defensive, is to have the following ability to process this information. To attend to your body senses. The sense kitchen, that's what I was talking about. Attend to your body senses. Your body defenses are down. You've learned about mindfulness. You've learned about that cosmology of, spirit, mind, and body, so that you relax. Your body is not armored and your defenses are down. The other ingredient of free choice responding to stress is cognitive processing. I talked about thinking in black and white terms versus the gray area. Emotional processing. Yes, I feel this way. Yes, this is my feeling. And, some people just want to go basically based on their emotions. And that's a kind of, I call that sort of the, what do I call that? I can't think of the name for it right now, but it's like the primitive kind of, I'm just going to say what I feel kind of philosophy. And I wish I could remember that word, but I can't. And then ego development and procedural learning. And procedural learning is just to learn a process for dealing with stress. And there's some good processes. I'm going to recommend a couple books for you. One is called Emotional First Aid, and that's in the Santa Cruz Library. And the other kind of information I'd give you is a book called The Workbook for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. And that just boils down to cognitive therapy with mindfulness. So I hope you'd enjoy this recipe for tender beings. And so if you run across a tender being, or you are a tender being, stay mindful. Try to figure out what your body state is, and figure out how you want to respond. Thanks very much. That's it.